I stood in the center of the Silver Lake Grand Hotel ballroom, where the crystal chandeliers reflected on the ceiling like stars trapped in glass. The vast space was bathed in hues of cream and burgundy wine, a color palette I had chosen 3 months ago after scrolling through nearly 200 mood boards. It was our 10th wedding anniversary, and I had sworn to make it a night no one would forget. The amber dress hugged my frame perfectly. It was a birthday gift from Mason last year, one I had never worn. He once said it made me look like a young woman stepping out of an oil painting. I had believed him, and tonight I wanted to believe again. Every detail of the party had been hand-picked by me, from the Napa Valley red wine Mason liked to the soft jazz ensemble I hired from San Francisco. I wanted him to walk in and remember why we once couldn't live without each other. I looked around as the guests began to fill the room. Everyone was dressed to impress, glasses clinking amid warm laughter. Everything felt almost perfect, until I spotted Mason in the far corner. He was standing next to a woman I didn't recognize, a brunette, at least 10 years younger than me, in a cobalt blue satin dress that clung tightly to her figure. I had never seen her before, and I was certain I wasn't the only one noticing the way Mason leaned in to whisper in her ear, or how his hand rested lightly on her lower back, as if the rest of the room had ceased to exist. My stomach sank. "Caroline, everything is beautiful," my mother-in-law said, approaching with a proud glance around the room. "Mason is a lucky man." I smiled. "Thank you, Mom." I didn't ask Mason who she was. This wasn't the time. I was afraid of making a scene in front of the very guests I had invited, while wearing the very dress he had once chosen. I walked over to the bar and ordered an apple martini, gripping the glass tightly so no one would see my hands tremble. "Who's that woman?" "Jenny, my best friend from college," whispered gently behind me. I didn't turn around, I simply shrugged. "Probably someone from work." Jenny said nothing more, but I saw her eyes quietly tracking Mason and the woman like a human radar. I knew Jenny didn't let things slide when they didn't feel right, and neither did I. But tonight, I didn't want to be the wife who suspected her husband, especially not on our 10th anniversary. I told myself Mason was an architect, a profession that meant working with female clients and traveling with them. She could be a client, a partner, anyone, just not what I feared. Then I heard him laugh at something she whispered. It was that kind of laugh, the one that used to belong to me. I suddenly felt suffocated. I had once believed nothing could shake my trust in Mason, but the look in his eyes tonight, magnetic, secretive, was no longer meant for the woman he had once vowed to love forever. I stood up, took a deep breath, and walked back into the party as if I had seen nothing at all. Tonight was the result of months of planning, of a heart still believing in something good. I reminded myself, no stranger's gaze had the power to ruin that. At least, not yet. The music softened a little as I made my way toward the cake table, where Mason and the woman were now standing. I wasn't sure why I was still holding a freshly poured glass of Pinot Noir. The stem felt cold against my skin, but my hand was steady. I wasn't going to start a fight. Just introduce myself. Or at the very least, confirm who I still was in this unfolding picture. Mason turned as I approached, his expression startled for a second, then cautious. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice a little tight. "I was just talking to—" "Hi," the woman interrupted with a flat smile. "I'm Talia. I work in project development at FutureBuild, Mason's partner firm." "Talia," I repeated, trying to sound pleasant. "Nice to meet you." I nodded slightly, extending my right hand for a shake. My left hand still held the wine. That moment could have passed without incident if my heel hadn't caught on the edge of the silk rug the staff had just laid down. I lost balance in less than a second. The wine tilted, and a ribbon of deep red arced through the air, landing squarely on Talia's blue satin dress. Everything froze. "Oh my God!" I gasped. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." I reached into my purse for a napkin, rushing to offer it, but Talia stepped back, her expression hardening. "This dress was custom-made," she said, her voice low and cold. "Do you have any idea how expensive it is?" "I'll cover the cleaning or replacement costs," I said quickly. "I really didn't mean to." "Are you always this clumsy?" Mason's voice cut in, sharp, cold. I turned to him, stunned. You just embarrassed me in front of my partners, he said, stepping closer, his eyes dark. At the party you planned, no less. I tripped, I exhaled, heat rising to my face. You're overreacting. Overreacting? He let out a dry laugh. You always do this. You ruin everything. I could feel the eyes of everyone around us locking in. The music had stopped. The only sounds left were Mason's voice and mine. Mason, can we talk about this later? People are staring. Exactly why I have to say this now. His eyes blazed with something I'd never seen before. I've had enough, Caroline. And then, as if acting on impulse or something he'd long wanted to do, his hand swung. The slap landed with a crack so loud I heard someone behind me gasp. My cheeks stung, my body jolted sideways, nearly falling. The wine glass shattered at my feet. Shards sparkled under the chandelier's light. No one spoke. I blinked rapidly, trying to gather myself. I stood upright. The crowd was frozen. Somewhere, a plate clinked to the floor, sharp breaths filled the silence, and then... nothing. Talia lightly touched Mason's arm, her face filled with regret. Maybe you should... Don't touch me, I whispered, my voice hoarse. My eyes were locked on Mason. What did you just do? Mason froze. It was as if he had just realized what he'd done. His face turned pale, eyes wide. But I didn't need an explanation. Across the ballroom, I saw someone cutting through the crowd. Tall, familiar. Brennan. My brother. I stood still, fists clenched, heart pounding so hard it echoed in my temples. Mason took a step back, his hand still hovering in the air as if he hadn't fully processed what had just happened. The crowded ballroom had fallen completely silent, every eye now on us. Where I had just been slapped by my husband, and my brother now stood like a wall made of flesh and fury. Brennan stepped forward. Let me get this straight. You just slapped my sister at her 10-year wedding anniversary? In front of 100 people? Mason stammered, Brennan, it's not what you think. Caroline spilled wine on a guest. He glanced around the room, as if searching for a way out, but there was no dark corner left for him to disappear into. Just let me explain. I think you're a coward, Brennan growled. And nothing proves it more clearly than tonight. He pulled his phone from the inside pocket of his blazer, opened a photo album and handed it to me. You need to see this. I hesitated, then took the phone. The first photo showed Mason and Talia walking hand in hand along the beach at a resort in Santa Barbara. The second, them exiting a boutique hotel in Napa Valley, dressed casually, fingers intertwined. Another showed them kissing inside the very SUV Mason drove to work every day. I scrolled through each one, the timestamps beneath the images landing like punches to the heart. I hired a private investigator 6 weeks ago, Brennan said quietly. After I noticed you'd been acting different, more withdrawn. I had a hunch, but I didn't want to assume anything without proof. I didn't look up. My eyes remained fixed on the 12th photo, Mason wrapping his arms around Talia from behind at an outdoor cafe. The date was my birthday. I warned you, Mason. Brennan turned back to him, his voice now tight with suppressed rage. If you ever hurt my sister, I wouldn't just stand by. You was spying on me? Mason snapped, anger suddenly boiling up, eyes wild. No, Brennan replied evenly. I was protecting my sister, something you clearly forgot how to do. Talia now stood frozen, face pale, her hands gripping the strap of her purse like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Caroline, she said softly. I didn't know he was still living with you. He told me you two were separated. I lifted my eyes. And you believed him? She looked down and didn't speak again. You don't have the right to threaten me, Mason said loudly, voice trembling with rage. I'll call the police if you... Thud. The punch came without warning. Quick, precise, fine. Mason collapsed onto the floor, his shoulders slamming into the edge of the buffet table, sending glasses and plates crashing to the ground. A single white tooth skidded out of his mouth, stopping near my feet. Blood began pooling across the polished marble floor. The room held its breath. I didn't flinch. I didn't scream. I just stood there, looking at the man who once vowed to protect me, now lying in a pile of shattered glass. Brennan shook out his hand and said calmly, "I should have done that 5 years ago." Mason groaned, trying to lift himself, but failed. Talia crouched to help him, but Mason shoved her away, face twisted in pain. Some guests began quietly slipping out. Others? Mason's old boss, my college friends, our neighbors, former colleagues, remained frozen in uncomfortable silence. But in their eyes I saw it. The truth was out. I handed the phone back to Brennan. "Thank you," I murmured. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked. I nodded. My cheek was still swollen, my chest still ached, but it felt like a heavy boulder had finally been lifted after all these months. Mason could scream, justify, spin stories, but tonight, in front of everyone, he had ended his role in my life with his own hand. I left the hotel just after 10:30 p.m., as the last murmurs faded into the night. My dress still sparkled, but beneath the fabric were bruised skin and a broken heart. Brennan drove me home, silent the whole way. No words were needed. He understood. Some wounds can't be patched with sympathy. The house I had lived in with Mason for nearly 8 years suddenly felt like a stranger's. Everything familiar now reeked of betrayal. I took off my earrings and placed them on the kitchen counter, as if shedding a costume I had worn to hide the years of being deceived. The next morning I received my first call from a lawyer, a woman named Rachel Vaughn, personally recommended by Brennan. "Caroline, I've seen the photos and statements from last night's party," she said, her voice calm but razor sharp. "A physical assault witnessed by over 100 people, combined with months of documented infidelity. You're in a very strong position. What does that mean for me?" I asked not out of greed, but because I needed clarity. I needed to know where I stood in this wreckage. "With Mason's income, the length of the marriage, and the very public nature of his actions," Rachel explained, "you can pursue ownership of the house, vehicles, financial assets, and likely qualify for long-term alimony. We could also go after his shares in the architectural firm." I didn't say anything for several seconds. A part of me wanted to scream that I didn't need any of it, that I just wanted none of this to have ever happened, but I knew the truth. There's no going back. And letting go didn't mean sparing someone from consequences they brought on themselves. "Shall we begin today?" Rachel asked. I nodded. "Let's begin." News from the party spread faster than I expected. By Monday morning, Mason was temporarily suspended from the firm. Several projects were put on hold because clients didn't want their names associated with a public scandal. Photos of his tooth flying out of his mouth and the blood smeared across the hotel floor had already surfaced on several local media outlets covering behind-the-scenes gossip in California's architecture and interior design circles. Talia vanished from social media. According to a friend in the industry, she had requested unpaid leave and withdrawn from all collaborative projects. Satisfaction never came. Only a hollow stillness remained, as if I had just stepped out of a long dream and realized I had forgotten myself for years. Lisa, my best friend, came to visit on Tuesday afternoon. She brought 2 cups of iced matcha and an understanding look in her eyes. "Everyone's on your side, Caroline," she said as we sat on the porch, looking out over the freshly mowed lawn. "No one can justify what Mason did." I gripped the cold drink tightly in my hands. "I don't need anyone to speak for me, I just need to keep going." Lisa placed her hand over mine and said nothing else. Sometimes silence is the only thing that can soothe a person after the collapse of an entire life. That weekend, Brennan took me to meet with Rachel again to sign the divorce papers. Everything had been prepared in advance, surprisingly fast and efficient. "Pammy?" "He didn't contest anything?" I asked. "No," Rachel replied as she flipped through the folder. His attorney knew they were in a weak position. Mason made only one request, to keep the divorce out of the press. I let out a short, bitter laugh. Too late. I signed my name, each stroke deliberate, like cutting away a part of me that had long since rotted, something I used to call love. On the ride home, I stared out the car window as the evening light fell across my face. One side of my cheek was still marked with yellow-green bruises, but my heart had never felt lighter. No one dreams of this kind of ending for a 10-year marriage. But I knew that truth was far more brutal than any beautiful illusion. and I couldn't let myself continue living in a story where the main character was her own source of misery. I left the house in Oakland one May morning, just as the sun touched the front steps. That house had once been a home, a place where I'd hung our first wedding photo, placed spring flowers on the dining table, and believed marriage could bridge any distance. But now, it was just a shell, filled with broken memories and wounds that would never heal. I didn't bring much. A few books, some pottery I had made myself, and the old coffee machine I refused to leave behind. Everything else, from the sofa Mason had chosen to the photo frames lining the hallway, I left. I didn't need to carry reminders of the place where I had been deceived. My destination was Santa Barbara, a quiet coastal city, far enough to keep the past at bay, close enough to feel somewhat familiar. I rented a small apartment near Cabrillo Boulevard, where I could hear the waves each morning and feel sunlight slipping through the curtains like a gentle hello. That first week, I did nothing. Slept a lot, drank coffee alone, walked along the beach without speaking to anyone. I learned how to be silent without feeling lonely. Learned how to sit beside my pain without letting it consume me. Then I opened up my old laptop, the one that held all my museum projects from over a decade. I had once been a curator at the Museum of Regional Culture, but years of admin work, endless meetings, and underappreciated pay had left me burnt out. Now, no one was forcing me back into that cycle. I called an old friend named Emma, who was now the executive director of a small museum in Ventura. "Caroline? I heard what happened." Her voice dropped. "Are you okay?" "I'm still standing," I said. "And I'm thinking of starting an independent consulting service for small museums. Do you know anyone who might need that?" Emma chuckled softly. "I don't just know someone. I'm that someone." 3 weeks later, I signed my first contract, redesigning the exhibition space and rewriting all the interpretive content for Emma's museum. The feeling of starting over with something I was truly good at, something I loved deeply, it felt like breathing again after being underwater for too long. I worked from my little apartment or brought my laptop to a cafe by the beach, where the sound of waves became the perfect, endless soundtrack. No pressure, no forced smiles. I worked when I was inspired, rested when I needed to, and each completed project felt like a quiet but powerful victory. One afternoon, as I was finishing a draft for an exhibit on Indigenous art, I looked out the window. The golden light of day's end spread across the ocean. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about Mason or Talia. There was no bitterness, no loss. Only one simple thought remained. I had survived. And now I was truly living. Brennan still called me every week. He always opened with, "Is the sun warm where you are?" and ended with, "If you need anything, just say the word." Lisa sent me postcards from every state she visited, each with the same message: "You deserve every good thing." I kept them all in a small wooden box by my bed. A quiet reminder that I was never really alone, even when it felt like I was. I wasn't sure if I'd stay in Santa Barbara forever. Maybe one day I'd move to San Diego, or some other city where a museum needed transformation and I could help bring something new to life. But I wasn't in a hurry. I had enough freedom now to choose, and that was the most valuable thing. I no longer needed anyone to define my worth, not the man who once said I was the burden of his carefully curated life. I was myself, and that was enough. One morning in late July, I was watering a few lavender pots on the balcony when my phone rang. Brennan's name appeared on the screen. "Got something for me?" I answered, my voice light as morning sun. "This might raise your eyebrows," he said bluntly. "Mason was arrested this morning." I froze, the water overflowing from the pot. "Arrested," I echoed, my heart skipping a beat. "For what?" "His old firm, Triarch Design, just finished an internal audit," Brennan replied. "Turns out Mason used project funds to cover a series of personal expenses, including a vacation with Talia, first-class flights, and an anonymous transfer to a private account." I leaned against the railing, still holding the running hose. "Did they call the police?" "Not just that. They handed everything over to the district attorney's office, and this morning he was handcuffed at his lawyer's office." Brennan paused. Looked like the one who reported him was Tom, his former partner. I didn't laugh. It didn't even surprise me. It was like the last layer of dust had finally blown away, revealing a truth that had been there all along. "You okay?" Brennan asked. "I'm okay," I replied shortly. "That has nothing to do with me anymore." After the call, I made a cup of peppermint tea and sat out on the porch, where the ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and the distant cries of gulls. It wasn't a feeling of victory, not even satisfaction. It was calm. Mason had once been part of my life. But now, whatever he was facing no longer touched me in any way. A few days later, Lisa texted me. "Delia's officially divorced. Her husband's a lawyer and had a tight prenup. She got nothing." I set the phone down without replying. I didn't want to let my mind spiral back into old loops anymore. They made their choices, and now they were paying for them. I kept working. Just last week I wrapped up my third project at a cultural center in Paso Robles. A small, cozy place filled with passion for native arts. They gave me full control over the layout, lighting, and interpretive material. During the opening, I overheard a 10-year-old girl clutch her mother's hand and whisper, "It feels like I'm walking into a fairy tale." I was behind the doors when I heard that. And I smiled, no applause needed, no validation sought. That night, I wrote in my journal, "A new habit since moving to Santa Barbara." On the day he was arrested, I didn't feel joy. Not regret, either. Just the realization that I'd walked so far. I couldn't even picture the face of the man who once made me cry. And that, right there, was the clearest sign of freedom. That night I slept deeply. No dreams, no confusion. Just a long stretch of stillness draped over me like a soft blanket. I knew things weren't entirely over. Mason would likely go to trial. The media might pick it up. His name might flash across my screen as I scrolled through the news. But I also knew his name had no place in the rest of my story. No one could bind me to old wounds anymore. I had walked through them, and now I kept walking, without looking back. That afternoon, I sat on the third-floor balcony of my new apartment, a glass of white wine in hand, my bare feet resting on the railing. The sunset stretched over the sea like a sheet of shimmering amber, and the waves rolled in like whispered blessings from the ocean. I hadn't heard anything else about Mason since Brennan called. The local news moved on, and his name stopped appearing in my alerts. I no longer cared. Silence wasn't scary anymore. It had become my most precious gift. No one could hurt me from a distance. I gently swirled the glass in my hand, watching the wine spin around the rim like a closed loop. It had been over 6 months since that anniversary night I once believed would mark a beautiful milestone. Turns out, it was the beginning of a completely different journey. A journey toward myself, not anyone else. Lisa once said, "Sometimes, revenge isn't about making someone suffer. It's letting them see you don't need them and still shine brighter than ever." I'm not sure if Mason still sees me. Maybe he watches from somewhere, or maybe he's turned away completely, but honestly, it no longer matters. I used to be the woman who always stayed quiet, who tried to patch every crack in the marriage with tenderness, with silence, with weary hope. But I'm not her anymore. I don't play the good wife in a story where I was no longer allowed to write the ending. Now I'm the one writing every new page of my life. A few weeks ago, I completed the biggest project since I started my consulting firm. A contemporary art museum in Monterey. They asked me to speak at the opening. I stood in front of nearly 100 people, talking about how light, material, and visual language could reshape the emotions people feel in cultural spaces. No one knew my personal history. I stood there with confidence, expertise, and presence, nothing to prove. That night, when I returned home, I received a text from an unknown number. "I saw your photo on Monterey's event page. You look well." No name, but I knew who it was. I read it, set the phone on the table, didn't delete it, didn't reply. There was nothing left to feel. Just a familiar note in a brand new song. It didn't ruin the melody. It just made me more grateful for everything I had now. I took another sip of wine, eyes tracing the horizon, fading into lavender. A group of children ran across the beach below, their laughter rising. The waves kept rolling, and my heart, for the first time in a very long time, felt at peace. Nothing to prove, no one left to blame, no need for tears or even apologies. I had forgiven myself for staying too long in something that no longer served me. I'd learned to rise, not to fight, but to move forward. And I understood now, freedom isn't about running from someone, it's when you stop thinking about them when you wake up in the morning. I raised my glass toward the sea glowing with the day's last light. To myself, I whispered. No reply came, only the steady breath of waves against the shore, soft and rhythmic. As if the world agreed. And I smiled, not a victor's smile, but the smile of someone who finally chose to live, and live well. Caroline's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes betrayal doesn't need to be met with anger or retaliation, but with the courage to walk away, heal, and build a more peaceful life. When we stop trying to be seen by those who never truly valued us, we begin to live for ourselves. Freedom, self-respect, and inner peace are the gentlest yet strongest forms of revenge, and the greatest triumph of someone who was once underestimated. What do you think about Caroline's decision? Would you be strong enough to walk away like she did? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to follow the channel for more emotional, heartfelt stories about life and family.